The floorboard lifted with a groan, and stale air exhaled from the gap like something long held, finally giving up. Her pry bar tapped iron. Against the subfloor's splinters, an edge appeared, blackened, cold, unyielding. She had inherited this cabin with its debts and its silence. Selling it meant clearing it, but something here resisted being packed away. The lock wasn't a lock at all. Wax pooled dark as bruised fruit, stamped with a sigil she knew from a banned collection at work. The weight of history sat heavy in her hands. This wasn't discovery. It was inheritance. No one could have predicted the emotional truth inside. Before we dive deeper, comment where you were watching this video from. Against one wall rested the rusting skeleton of a stove, its door hanging slightly ajar, as if the room had paused mid-breath decades ago and never finished. The porch outside was lichen-bitten and soft underfoot, and the ridge held the wind like a mouth holds a vow. She stood in the doorway first, reluctant. A meticulous archivist by training, she had always been taught to preserve, not disturb, to leave arrangement undisturbed unless the record required intervention. Yet here she was with a pry bar, alone, the air heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long-decayed hay, about to alter the order of a place she barely remembered. Estranged relative, the will had said. No story attached, only coordinates and taxes due by the end of the quarter. The letter from the county was brisk: pay or surrender. The caretaker's note was stranger still. He kept records no one wanted, as if warning and invitation could fit in the same line. The weight of the purchase pressed on her far heavier than any price tag could. She had not bought anything. She had been handed a burden. The following moments passed in a blur of labor and sweat as she pushed the sagging door wider, checked for rot underfoot, and tested the joists. In the back room, the boards rippled with old water damage. She traced a finger across a hairline seam near the hearth, felt a temperature change under her nails. When the pry bar finally levered the plank, the space beneath breathed out, a hollow, cool sigh that unsettled the quiet. The chest revealed itself without ceremony, iron-banded, shorter than a coffin, longer than a trunk for travel. The steel at its edges was corroded, pitted, but the seal on its front was intact. Indigo wax poured thick and neat, bearing a sigil she had seen exactly twice before in a set of restricted pamphlets the institution kept in a locked cabinet. A ring of wheat broken by a narrow blade, a motto in a cramped hand about order and improvement. She had skimmed those pages once, gloved and careful, and stepped away feeling the air bend. She lifted the chest gently, testing weight and listening for slosh or shift. It was heavy, as if paper had been compacted into something denser than paper. No rattle, no looseness. She set it on a blanket and scanned the joist cavity. Against rough wood, wrapped in cloth the color of a winter sky, lay a small key. The shape suggested a simple warded lock, but there was no keyhole, only wax and the sigil's insistence. The key's purpose lay elsewhere, or it was bait. She did not like either conclusion. Outside, the ridge fell away to a gully gone to alder. A narrow road wound down toward a town that pretended it had never been small. The hardware store had new signage. The diner's server had asked if she was the one with the cabin, and a voice from a corner booth murmured, "She won't last the winter." Whispers slide faster than wind. She logged the moment like an accession number, provenance uncertain, tone suggestive. Legacy pressure pressed in from every side. The institution had already hinted that she should liquidate quickly, cut ties, turn receipts in. Her practical mind kept tally, taxes, insurance, repairs. Yet beneath her determination, unease coiled. She could sell the structure and keep its contents, she told herself. She could keep the contents and still sleep. The problem was not the real estate. It was the record. Professional curiosity was a steady instrument in her hands, but fear sharpened the blade. She knew how quickly fragile media died when exposed to wrong hands or wrong light. She knew, too, that some truths, once unsealed, slipped into lives and cut years after. The caretaker's warning had been soft. He kept records no one wanted. She heard the echo layered under it. No one except you. She knelt by the chest and brought her face close to the seal without touching. The wax carried a faint scent, resin and something floral, medicinal in the nose, like yarrow crushed under a boot. The sigil's lines were crisp, not the smeared edges of a hasty job. Whoever sealed this did it calmly, with practice. She catalogued that detail as well. Calmness could be a mask for cruelty. Ethics pooled at the edges of her training. Opening could implicate living families and unspool the tidy stories that held people together. Leaving it closed might bury victims deeper, refuse them even a name. The truth was worse when it had bylaws. She didn't know that yet, but she felt the contour of the shape waiting for her. She rubbed her thumb across her palm, a habit from long reading nights, and stood. As the door closed behind her with a hollow click, she decided to open it at dawn. Dawn would give her light without heat, time to prepare, and a line she could cross with intention. She set the chest on the floor where the board had been. She laid the key on the windowsill. She opened her notebook and wrote the sigil's description as precisely as her hand could. Then she waited for the ridge to go dark around her, the silence to thicken as she descended the ladder to the narrow bed. Time was running out, and the record was already awake. Dawn set the dust afloat like ash from a controlled burn. She washed her hands, tied her hair back, and laid out tools the way she did before any delicate accession: scalpel, bone folder, cotton twill tape, acid-free sheets. The wax's indigo sheen held the room's dim light. She documented every angle, noted the hairline crack near the sigil's rim, then slipped the blade in along the edge where the seal met iron. The first flake lifted clean. Resin murmured as it gave. When the seal broke, the smell of old oil and moth and iron rose like a kept promise. The lid resisted. She eased it up with a folded cloth to buffer friction, mindful of the hinge's corroded teeth. Inside lay a careful order. On top, a ledger wrapped in oilcloth, edges dark with hand grease and years. Beneath it, envelopes of glass negatives tucked in, their corners braced by cut cardboard. 2 rolled plats, hand-drawn, secured by brittle blue ribbon. In a velvet pouch, small and heavy for its size, something shifted with a whisper. She did not reach for the pouch. Catalog first, always catalog first. Tension threaded her patience. She wanted truth to assess the property and the cost of keeping it, but coded indexes and fragile media made haste into harm. She photographed placement. She logged the sequence aloud, voice steady in the empty room. Ledger, primary. Negatives, secondary. Glass, risk high. Plats, ink unknown. Pouch, contents unspecified. Failure here would be the kind that destroyed history without telling it. She unwrapped the ledger, The cover had been rebinding after rebinding, a palimpsest of repairs. Inside, a hand practiced and unyielding had ruled columns with a nib that bit the page. Name, relation, sum, assurance, removal. The script marched straight, indifferent to margin. Entries clustered in two distinct weather fronts, first during the influenza years, then again when strikes shuttered mills upriver. Sometimes the same surname repeated with different first names spaced months apart, as if a house had been visited more than once by misfortune that wasn't quite accidental. Assurance bore numbers that matched sacks of feed, small cash, credit at the mercantile. Removal bore numbers in a different ink, larger, sometimes circled. A chill passed as she traced a finger above the word without touching it. Removal to where? Removal of what? The ledger did not say. It balanced itself with the logic of commerce. It treated births and debts as if they were the same unit of measure. She realized it too late to stop the thought. Some columns were weighted with absence. She slid a glass negative free by its paper sleeve. The emulsion's shimmer warned her not to breathe too near. Held up, the image reversed. Rural portraits with faces turned slightly away, the stiff patience of exposure times etched in neck tendons and clenched hands. Behind several, on a barn's beam, a mark branded into the timber, a narrow blade interrupting a ring of grain, the same sigil hardened into wood, not wax. She had learned to distrust symbols that traveled like that, from paper to architecture, from idea to enforcement. She set the plate down on a padded board. In another sleeve, a portrait looked empty until the light found a woman's profile at the edge, one eye turned to the camera and then away, a lace ribbon at her throat, the other hand tucked under a shawl as if hiding something soft. The photographer's angle allowed a sliver of the room's corner. Shelves, a basin, the suggestion of a narrow bed. Midwife care could look like this. It could also be a foyer, a staging point, an intake. She unrolled the plats with the care due a brittle map. Hand-drawn lots quilted the land around the cabin. Lines demarcated tenant plots with clean confidence. One boundary had been traced heavier, as though the drafter's hand pressed down harder there, as if to keep something in or out. The tract enclosed households with surnames she didn't recognize. Recent arrivals by the spelling. Consonants left in, vowels clipped. Outside the bold line, annotations read, assurance granted, credit extended. Inside, more often, removal assessed. The ink was the same intent in both notes. The difference lay in weight. Her own breath intruded, too loud. She stopped, let the room settle back. The institutional voice in her head reminded her that maps lie in the ways all maps lie, by flattening terrain, by making human choices look inevitable. But the choices here had a pattern that fingerprinted the page. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. Yet beneath her determination, unease coiled tighter. Patterns are not proof, she thought. Patterns are paths someone walked often enough to leave worn ground. Beneath the ledger, a smaller sealed packet rested like a second heart. Paper edges dyed dark to discourage prying. On its face, in that same calm hand, a label. Covenant. Indigo wax again, but this time stamped shallow, as if the seal had been pressed quickly, an interruption. She placed the packet aside, catalog first. The discipline steadied her. She numbered every sleeve of glass, described each plate's content in terse phrases, kept her adjectives neutral and exacting. Male, adult, seated, gaze averted. Female, adolescent, standing, hair braided, hand fisted in skirt. Infant, swaddled, eyes closed. Barn beam, brand visible. Counter, ledger open in background. When she finally allowed herself the velvet pouch, the nap rasped against her skin. Inside, a locket waited, oval and plain, dented where thumbs had worried it over years. Its hinge resisted, gummy with age. She set it down. Later. Do not force. She returned to the ledger, now deeper in, pages that bore addenda pinned to the tops with straight pins driven through, notes that read, assurance withheld pending conduct, removal accelerated upon refusal. In some margins, names had been scraped off with a knife, leaving a faint, furry abrasion where identities had been. If a name was a key, someone had filed teeth down. The chest's architecture suggested a mind that liked compartments. Under the lower false bottom, she found a cache of thin slips, each with a single line. Payment accepted, placement secured. No location, no description. Only verbs that moved people as if they were goods. Her jaw tightened. She thought of the institution's code of neutrality, the way it could become complicity when applied to living consequences. Calmness could be a mask for cruelty. Here, it had hardened into a method. She looked up and caught the window's reflection of herself, small in the warped glass, the room's past pressing around her like water. This was not a treasure. It was a legacy. The packet labeled Covenant waited, patient as stone. 3 hours later, she stood under the courthouse clock that kept chiming a minute slow, a petty defiance the town had learned to love. The records room smelled of linen paper and mildew, cabinets lined like centuries, their brass poles worn smooth by decades of quiet hands. She signed the log with her institutional hand, careful, neutral, then asked for petitions and minutes concerning charitable associations, improvement committees, anything with a moral umbrella wide enough to hide a storm. The clerk brought out bound volumes in buckram, spine cracked but serviceable. Petitions first, typewritten lines that begged grant money to form a moral welfare association, phrased in the soothing jargon of uplift. Words like purity and efficiency appeared alongside relief and sanitation, a mingling that rang like a cracked bell. The minutes referenced quiet relocations, improvement drives, volunteer midwifery, all of it wrapped in civility's ribbon. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. It was not mere charity. It was management. A surname repeated through the pages with the patience of lichen on stone. Secretary. The same family name branded beneath the negative's barn beam. The same hand that had ruled the ledger with unyielding lines. The secretary recorded motions with ceremonial precision, noted votes, assigned tasks. It seemed harmless in isolation. In aggregate, it felt like orchestration. She requested files adjacent to the association's existence. Health department notices, poorhouse reports, relief ledgers from winters when coal ran thin. Cross-references multiplied. A county doctor praised the association's effort to alleviate inherited burdens. A sheriff's note commended orderly outcomes. The euphemisms gathered like fog along the ridgeline. She did not need a manifesto. She needed patterns that showed methods alive in their banal phrasing. Newspapers preserved in microfilm offered praise songs to order. Editorials lauded moral hygiene, thanked donors for keeping standards. An obituary listed an unnamed infant, angel returned. No cause, no parents, no dates beyond a week's span. A column announced adoption fairs at the Grange, cheery as a harvest festival, the event framed as opportunity for childless homes, and children spared the specter of want. She read the line twice, the way the word spared held a knife inside it. The heavy boundary on the plats troubled her. She overlaid a historical map against current parcels, tracing with a transparency and the flat of her hand to keep static down. Households inside the bold line clustered around the cabin's elevation. Surnames skewed toward recent arrivals in the decades the ledger emphasized. Outside the line, old, established families. An index card in the association file explained assurance credits extended to households that participated in improvement projects. Another memo outlined removal fees assessed in hardship cases where domestic order cannot be maintained. The language remained scrubbed. The meaning did not. She visited the Historical Society, its volunteer archivist, an older woman who eyed the institutional badge and softened only when the locket's outline bulged the pocket, as if the weight of a small thing signaled seriousness. Adoption fairs, the woman repeated, then offered a clipped nod. Back then, people called it placement. The Grange kept Dorcas tables, clothes, blankets, made it look like generosity. Her voice kept steady, but the fingertip resting on the desk pressed white against wood. Some of those names never aligned again. Eugenic ideas drifted in from neighboring states in pamphlets and lectures. She found announcements for visiting speakers with doctor before their names, sponsored by the association, talking points about lineage and civic health. The town hadn't led the charge. It had simply been hospitable to a rhetoric that made cruelty appear prudent. The secretary wrote thank you notes to donors, pinned to minutes with perfect corners, each one dated and filed. She read one aloud under her breath. Your support assures that our community's future is unblemished. The phrasing tasted metallic. What, precisely, did the cabin do within this machine? The caretaker's remark returned. He kept records no one wanted, and clarified itself. Intake could be a porch and a basin and a ledger. Midwife care could cover for a practical process, assess need, assess solvency, extract the debt as a name exchanged. The cabin's boundary line became less an edge than a membrane. Those within were subject to removal fees, those without padded with assurance credits, the two columns balancing each other with a logic that rewarded conformity. She pulled marriage licenses and birth records, looking for anomalies. Certain birth fields were left blank with a regularity that implied policy. Other certificates had addresses struck through with the same blunt pencil, replaced with a P.O. box that matched the association's mail. The clerk sighed in that tired way people sigh when they do not want to notice, and brought out a drawer of correspondence. A typed letter from a state office congratulated the town for its model approach to domestic stabilization. She copied what she could, careful not to photograph living names indiscriminately. The ethic was a tightrope over obligation. The truth was gathering form briskly. She needed to see the secretary's voice outside minutes. The library's vertical file yielded clippings of club speeches. One quoted him, "Rescues are not always loud. Sometimes they are the simple removal of a burden from a wayward doorstep." The room cooled. He had believed himself a benefactor. Across town, unaware of the danger it would pose, a mural in the Grange Hall showed wheat sheaves in a circle around a clear field, the center unmarred, the border cut clean. The brand on the barn beam had been art before it was enforcement. The association hosted socials beneath that emblem, handed out ribbons stamped with it, framed it as a promise of cleanliness. But the map overlay refused to agree. The clean center had been curated. Disorder had been relocated out of sight. The cost was human. The caretaker emerged from the courthouse porch as she stepped out, his hat in his hands, though there was no rain. "Folks feel strongly about the old associations," he said without greeting, voice caught between caution and apology. "They remember food boxes more than anything else." He did not say the rest. She waited. He looked away. "There are bylaws in the older boxes," he murmured. "Not here. At the cabin." The sense landed like a stone. The packet labeled Covenant would not offer absolution. It would define terms. She went back up the ridge with dusk leaning hard into the trees. The road crawled beneath the car, the air heavy with damp leaf and iron. The motive was not madness. It was tidy, respectable cruelty, drafted in minutes and sealed with wax scented like medicine and meadow both. The truth was worse than rumor because it had paperwork. Therefore she returned to the chest for the sealed packet, her hands steady because there was nothing steady left outside the record. The packet met her hands with a papery resistance. Edges dyed to expose tampering, the indigo seal pressed at a slant, as if the moment of sealing had been interrupted by a footstep in the hall. She photographed front and back, captured the angle of the seal, then breathed once to steady her fingers. The blade slipped beneath the lip of wax. Resin cracked in a soft, dry sigh. A scent surfaced, iron, old ink, and that same medicinal sweetness of yarrow, intrusive and oddly tender, like comfort offered after harm. Inside lay carbon copies feathered with the faint violet of duplicator ink, their onion skin translucent enough to show ghost text bleeding from the sheet beneath. Covenant Agreement, the header read in a centered typeface, clipped and austere. Clauses stacked with spare numerals. The signatory line left room for a mark, no flourish, no space for a second thought. She set the first page on a mat and began to read aloud, a habit that kept her honest to phrasing. By these present lines, the association, desiring the stability and improvement of our community legacy, enters into covenant with the household hereunto subscribed. The language draped itself in dignity. In exchange for assurances rendered, debts indicated below shall be struck. The word struck made her jaw clench. Where domestic irregularity threatens orderly inheritance, the association shall secure placement for the minor issue. Placement arrived without location, as if heaven itself were the address. The household hereby relinquishes future claim and contact. Each must conduce to the welfare of the whole. She turned the page. Testimonial paragraphs followed, stilted, as if dictated to those who had never needed to sign more than a receipt. "I am relieved of a burden," one began, the script after the mark more confident than the shaky X. Another read, "They told me the child will be well." The statement's sameness betrayed a prompt. She traced the impression the typewriter had left, the way certain keys bit deeper. E, R, suggesting an operator who leaned forward as sentences hardened. Pinned at the back of the packet, a private letter waited in a plain envelope. addressed in the same hand as the ledger to the custodian after me. Her breath shortened. The return address line was empty. She lifted the flap with a scalpel, preserving the gum line for later analysis, and slid the letter free. Thick paper, numbered pages. The voice that met her was calm, persuasive, almost paternal. "If you are reading," he began, "then you have accepted what the town requires, and you must understand the spirit of our work. Rescue is not always loud. It is the quiet removal of disruptive threads for the integrity of the cloth." The analogy settled over her like dust. He wrote of salvage for the community legacy, of the duty of orderly men to ensure that future genealogies do not break under weight. He invoked scripture without citation, law without named statute. He framed the cabin as a place of interim compassion, where stains were lifted before they set. He praised the covenant's simplicity, no courtroom spectacle, no gossip, and boasted of the few refusals encountered. A brief line chilled the room. "Burn the paper of refusals. Do not preserve disobedience for the curious." There it was, confession by omission. He wrote that no mother must be allowed to keep a reminder when removal serves her good. Good appeared as a polished word, placed with care, used to sell absence as medicine. She set the letter down and loosened her shoulders slowly, the way one removes a tight bandage. The weight of history sat heavy in her hands. He had known precisely what he was doing. Beneath a final paragraph, "Your charge is to continue without noise," he'd signed with the same intimate economy as in the minutes. Secretary. No personal name, just the office. The person dissolved into a role, as if anonymity itself conferred virtue. She returned to the covenants. Each bore a table. Debts listed on one side, feed, rent arrears, doctor visits, balanced by assurances granted, sack count, cash tendered, lines of credit noted with initials from the mercantile and mill. The final column, euphemistic and clean, read, "Placement secured." Opposite it, a date, a set of initials in a new hand she had not yet seen in the ledger. The administrative lattice was thorough. Moral certainty vibrated between the lines. She heard it in the clipped phrasing, the procedural comfort that cloaked extraction. Between the tissue-bound covenants lay something delicate, a pressed sprig of yarrow. Its yellow turned the color of old bone, petals flattened into paper's memory. Yarrow for wound healing, for staunching blood, for easing pain. The herb's symbolism lived in the secretary's logic as a brand of mercy. He had folded a field into an emblem and used it as alibi. She held the sprig close enough to scent the ghost of meadow clinging to the fibers. The tenderness of the plant against the hard intent of the page unsettled her. She reached, at last, for the velvet pouch and eased the locket into her palm. Its hinge murmured in protest. She worked the seam with the tip of a blade until it yielded. Inside, framed in a ring of tarnished metal, 2 locks of hair curled, a pale thread and a darker one, clipped at different times, different textures, coiled together. The realization came as a quiet blow. 2 lives, reduced to relic, bound to make separation feel like a keepsake. A mother and a child, divided by design, threaded together only in ornament. She rested the locket against the letter. The juxtaposition made the intention undeniable. Fear of disorder, desire for a curated town image, personal ambition to be remembered as benefactor. His motive crystallized, not in rage, but in unyielding tidiness. He had believed that smoothing the ledger would smooth the future. He had given himself the role of custodian and then written the job description as absolution. The last page of the letter offered instructions for succession. "Hide the key where wood meets beam," he wrote. "Keep yarrow in the seal to remind the hand that does the hurting that it heals." His rhetoric tried to blunt the edges even as it tightened them. The charge to the future custodian was clear: maintain the membrane, do not let sentiment soften your grip. He had treated empathy as a leak to be patched. She placed the letter back in its sleeve and returned to the carbon copies for dates, cross-referencing with ledger clusters, influenza years, strike winters, times when debt and grief ripened together. He had harvested under cover of charity. She copied phrases into her notebook verbatim, unwilling to dilute their violence with paraphrase. Relinquishes future contact, placement in suitable home, domestic irregularity. She heard the hiss of erasure in each line. It was not discovery, it was inheritance. The obligation to act came braided with the evidence she held. Yet beneath her determination, unease coiled tighter. Euphemisms were fortresses. Communities learned to live inside them. If she exposed this, living people would bleed. If she did not, the covenant would continue to govern memory. She tucked the sprig of yarrow into an acid-free envelope, logged the hair's presence without flourish, and lifted her eyes to the window where evening had pooled like ink. It was not just discovery, it was inheritance. Therefore, she would test the archive against living memory. She would ask the town to answer the ledger with their own names. The letter's calm voice lingered in the room like a judge who had already decided. She closed the packet, sealed it in a temporary sleeve, and listened to the silence thicken as she descended the ladder toward a night that would not sleep. The following days passed in a blur of small doors opening and closing before her face. She wanted corroboration, sound that matched the shape of the record, yet denial rose like a practiced hymn. She began with a retired nurse whose porch sagged toward a ditch thick with ferns. The woman's hands trembled until they found a mug. "Midnight carriages," she said, almost to herself. A lantern hooded, a cough hidden with a scarf. We called it mercy. The word hung, thin and brittle. When asked about the cabin, the nurse's eyes drifted to the ridge as if the trees might answer. "Sometimes," she whispered, "they came back lighter." She did not explain lighter. At a farm beyond the creek, a man oiling a gate looked up at the mention of the brand. "Warranty mark," he said, as if reciting. Meant the association would stand behind an outcome. He did not meet her eyes. His son, nearby, turned the word warranty over in his mouth like a smooth stone, then spit into the grass as if to be rid of its taste. She noted the cadence of the phrase, the way it had been talked to him as a truth unargued. She returned to the institution and asked for guidance. The supervisor's reply slid across a desk like a cold plate. "Opening old wounds yields few grants," they said, with a shrug smoothed into policy. "Be cautious with names. Be cautious with accusation." She understood procedure and its use as shield, yet beneath her determination, unease coiled tighter. Neutrality has a way of leaning toward whoever wielded it first. A local official intercepted her on the courthouse stairs. "Careful," he murmured, a smile pinned in place. "We don't want defamation suits. Donate the chest sealed to the museum. Context will be provided. The word context bent under the load they placed on it. He touched the banister as if the wood could witness his reasonableness. She heard the quieter sentence underneath. Let it rest. Let us rest. She tried another route. Anonymity. She scanned a handful of covenant pages with identifying marks masked, wrote a summary that refused adjectives, and sent it to a regional paper. The piece was flagged by legal within hours. Unconfirmed source, stated the reply. Potential harm. The caretaker arrived that evening with a folded note, the crease sharp as warning. Someone else wants the chest, it read. We can arrange transfer. He would not look at the packet she held, would not look at the locket, only at the threshold, as if crossing it would stain his boots. Micro-stories rose like minnows hitting the surface. At the edge of the post office lot, a woman unfolded a birth certificate whose address line had been struck through and replaced by a box number. It doesn't matter, she said, voice flat, fingers bloodying their tips against a faded ribbon pulled from her pocket. Of course it mattered. The ribbon's color had drained to a pale, stubborn pink, as if it had survived a wash too rough for it. She did not want her name recorded. She only wanted the ribbon seen. The ethical pressure whittled at Sleep. If she published, families might fracture under truths they'd been taught to dread. If she buried it, the community's myth would continue to hum, low and steady, like a machine maintained by habit. Time was running out. She opened her notebook and drew a line down the center, harm imagined, harm already done, and watched both columns fill. She began to listen for verbs. Told, promised, refused, retrieved. A man on the edge of town recalled a rattle in a wagon at dawn. Not a milk rack, he said, smaller. He set his jaw and did not describe it further. A librarian found a pamphlet misfiled among hymnals. Someone had tucked it away years ago, an instinctive counter-archive. The pamphlet praised orderly placement, with photographs cropped at the hands, as if fingers told a story better left unsaid. The moment she left the archive one late afternoon, the ridge looked too dark for the hour. Her key met the cabin door and found the lock slack. Inside, the air had shifted. The chest's lid sat an inch askew, the seal on the covenant packet rebroken in a rough, modern hand. The velvet pouch lay open, the locket still inside, as if whoever had come had reached, recognized, recoiled, and left with only the certainty that someone else would finish what they could not. The board she had pried days ago leaned against the wall like a witness. She catalogued the disturbance the way she catalogued all else. Mud print near the hearth. A scuff at waist height on the jamb. Yarrow scent stronger, crushed underfoot. She photographed the angle of the disturbed lid and saw, in the shadowed gap, a new slip she had not logged. It had been tucked between false bottom and hinge, perhaps dislodged by the intruder's haste. Her gloves felt suddenly clumsy as she eased it free. The slip bore a single line in a different hand than the secretary's, patient and neat. Custodian affirmed. The date trailed decades beyond the secretary's death. The room tightened around the words. A successor had inherited not the chest, but the duty. The network she had sensed in minutes and polite warnings breathed in the dust motes like a patient animal. She stood very still and let the implications speak themselves. The caretaker's eyes, the official's smile, the museum's offer of sealed context. As the door closed behind her with a careful, deliberate push, she understood the next step would not be quieter. The living record had answered. It had tried to take the chest without taking its contents. It had left a message instead. Therefore, she would choose her next move where witnesses were not minutes on paper, but people in chairs. The Ridge watched her make the decision. The silence did not intrude. It steadied. Night held to the rafters as if refusing to relinquish its claim. She set the slip on the table, the words "custodian" affirmed, facing her like a quiet oath, and traced the ink's steadiness without touching it. She wanted to protect the artifacts. The block stood larger now, a quiet network tied to the old association, comfortable with sealed context and polite refusals. Failure here meant more than embarrassment. It meant erasure of proof. It meant the ledger re-entering the dark. She found the new disturbance by sound. A hollow underfoot that hadn't been hollow before. Knees to the plank, breath measured, she followed the note of loosened wood to a narrow board tucked near the bed frame. The nailheads bore fresh scuffs. She levered it up and reached into the seam. Her fingers met paper wrapped in oilskin, still supple with age. Inside, a ledger leaf, not from the main volume, dated decades after the secretary's last entry. The hand was tidy, different. Custodian affirmed, it repeated, then a tally. Assurances extended, removals completed, no refusals preserved. Beneath, a yarrow stamp in faint indigo. Continuity had been maintained with ceremony. The caretaker knocked as the ridge thinned to gray. He kept his hat in both hands again, eyes fixed on its brim. "I know what you found," he said before she could speak. His voice had dropped the neighborly lilt. What remained sounded like duty worn thin. The covenant prevented turning neighbor against neighbor. He gestured toward the chest without looking at it. "Let it rest. Mercy sometimes looks like forgetting." She set the locket between them. The hair curled within it caught a thread of light. She laid out the bylaws, recited the phrases he had likely heard since boyhood, placed the pressed yarrow on the table. "Wound healing," she said, and he nodded reflexively. She held the letter's line in the air. No mother must be allowed to keep a reminder. His jaw worked. "Mercy isn't amputation," she said softly. "We have been binding silence and calling it care." He winced at the word amputation, like a man recognizing a scar he had learned to ignore. "You'll break people," he whispered. Sometimes, he whispered, some are barely held together as it is. She let the truth of that sit between them. Then she answered with another truth. They were broken before I arrived. The difference now is whether the ledger carries their names or only their debts. Footfalls crunched the frosted grass outside. A car door shut with deliberate care. She watched the caretaker straighten, hat rising like a shield until he remembered himself and set it down. 3 people crossed the threshold moments later, their clothing neat as a meeting, faces schooled to civility. The surname they offered matched the secretary's. The eldest, silver hair combed, hands clean, smiled without warmth. "We heard you inherited a burden," he began. "We can buy the burden." He placed an envelope on the table as if making an offering. The paper was thick. She did not reach for it. The younger woman with him scanned the room, pausing at the plat laid open to the heavy boundary line, then at the locket, and finally at the packet sleeve. "We want what's ours," she said, the last word clipped. The phrase tilted the room. She thought of the ledger's possessive grammar. She asked simply, "What is yours?" The eldest answered smoothly, "Stewardship, reputation, continuity." He gestured toward the chest. "It is dangerous in untrained hands." She did not bother naming her profession. They had likely already filed it under trouble. He added, "We'll fund conservation. We'll endow a glass case." Context. The word arrived polished, prepared to do labor it could not ethically do. She spoke of bylaws, of euphemisms sharpened into tools, of the margin knife that had scraped identities into furred erasures. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse in adjectives. She read sentences. Relinquishes future contact. Placement secured. Burn the paper of refusals. The younger woman flinched at the last line, a flicker of something untrained in her schooling. The eldest placed 2 fingers on the envelope and slid it an inch closer, as if proximity might soften the decision. The caretaker swallowed and stepped between, palms out. "Let's be reasonable," he urged, the phrase worn smooth by overuse. "It keeps the peace." She heard what peace meant. A surface without ripples, a town that slept without questions. The cost of that sleep lay coiled in the locket, pressed into yarrow, inked into columns where births and debts balanced with impossible neatness. The eldest's tone cooled. "Sell to us," he said. "We will manage the narrative with care. Families won't be harmed. Your taxes vanish." He nodded toward the envelope. The breath she took felt like stepping into cold water. She had no choice but to decide, sell silence or risk the town's fragile peace. The burden sat in her hands, heavy as any key she had ever lifted. She looked at the caretaker, at his tired decency bent in the wrong direction. She looked at the younger woman's unsettled eyes. She looked at the thick paper promising comfort. She closed the envelope with 2 fingertips and slid it back across the table. The air in the room altered, thicker, truer. She said, "The archive is not your inheritance. The harm is." The network drew itself taut around her like wire. Outside, the wind pressed its palm against the cabin's boards. Inside, the record did what records do when read aloud. It refused to forget. She moved like a custodian of fire. Before dawn, she copied every page, ledger leaves, covenants, the letter, the map overlays, into redundant forms, digital scans, photographic contacts, typed transcripts with bracketed gaps where names would wait for consent. She packed envelopes for multiple repositories, stamped and sealed so the story could not be extinguished by one pair of hands. Then she booked the Grange Hall, under the mural of wheat. She wrote a notice in plain words, public reading of documents concerning past placements and debts. Bring what you know. No accusations, only pages and memory. The caretaker posted it on the corkboard without comment. The elder family watched and did not intervene. Their confidence in silence surprised her. It would not last. Chairs filled with the careful and the curious. She began with minutes and bylaws. Let the secretary's sentences indict themselves. She read the covenant phrases clean. Relinquishes future contact. Placement secured. Burn the paper of refusals. The room shifted, an old building learning a new weight. She turned the ledger so the columns faced those who had been accounted for. Halfway through, an older woman stood. Her voice reached from the back. She spoke a name the ledger had filed under removal. From near the door, a thinner voice answered, "Present." Another stood. Present. A man, hand on cane, mouth working around a surname that had been sanded off in the margins. Present. The sound assembled into a ledger that refused arithmetic. The portrait of the benefactor came down without ceremony. Hands set it against the wall, glass reflecting the room like a river. After, they carried the Barnes brand plank in from a shed and set to sanding. The mark thinned, blurred, then vanished under the slow insistence of grit and patience. It did not undo harm. It altered the present. The younger woman from the family stepped forward, ribbon in her palm. She did not speak. She placed it on the ledger's spine, then stepped back, eyes fixed on the floor. The sail of the cabin buckled. The elder family talked of lawyers. The caretaker slept poorly. She accepted the cost without posturing. She had chosen to be the one who unsealed what others had practiced forgetting. The locket, finally coaxed open, held its paired strands steady in a glass case with a line beneath. Artifact of separation, preserved to prevent recurrence. And yet, as she closed the doors of the cabin one last time, the silence was different. Less intrusive, more truthful. The chest remained open on the bare floor, its compartments emptied of secrecy, but full of names, the room faintly scented with iron and crushed yarrow. The weight of history no longer sealed and no longer pretending to heal by erasing. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If this legacy unsettled you and made you think about the burdens objects carry and the euphemisms that hide wounds, follow the channel to uncover more forgotten legacies. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from.